Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt. I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois. My research interests are media archaeology, cultural theory, and Christianity and leftist politics.
I'm Dean Detloff. I'm a Catholic PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto. And right now, my research interests are learning about all the people that won elections yesterday, I guess. That's what I'm trying to figure out real quick.
Oh, yeah.
Shout out to socialists who won real-life seats in places. That's really cool.
You done did it. You're making us proud over here.
Socialism will not be elected, but also, give it a try.
Yeah, I'm open to it.
Yeah. It wouldn't be the worst thing.
No. It would be a good one. A good thing to happen, I think.
Matt, what have you been up to this week?
I've had a crazy busy week, crazy busy semester. Man, I'm super excited for Thanksgiving break. We have a Thanksgiving break. Isn't that weird? I feel like usually people don't have that, but we have like an entire week off for Thanksgiving.
Wow, that's a long thing.
Yeah, it is. It's super long. Students were like losing their mind about it, and they're like, "Oh man, so excited, no class." And I'm like, if you think you're excited, let me tell you about my excitement level.
Here's a pile of homework.
Yeah. I did actually assign 2 things in one of my classes last night they have to have done after that break. So I feel a little bit bad, but not too bad. Anyway, so that's coming up. Looking forward to it. Also, I had a really great time earlier this week. Richard Gilman-Opolsky came to speak at my university on incarceration, race, and revolt, and it was so good. Oh my gosh.
Awesome.
Yeah, dude. It was good for a lot of reasons. First of all, I got to hang out with him for a few hours, and that was very fun. He's like the nicest person on the planet, and that's cool. He gave this great talk though, that kind of reiterates a lot of things that we've said in this podcast before about him, and that is contained within his newest book, Spectres of Revolt. Go check it out. Seriously, if you haven't bought it and read it yet, I don't know what you're doing. Anyways, the main point was just that people should just not discount revolt immediately as irrational or like something that is kind of just done for less than logical reasons. That you should listen to revolt because they actually are philosophical acts that can tell you something, and that is such a cool idea, and I think everyone needs to hear that all the time.
Yeah, that's good, especially at an evangelical school. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, for sure. There definitely was a little bit of conservative pushback, but but it got taken care of. There were some pretty weird comments, but it was good. Richard gave some great and charitable responses.
That's cool.
Sometimes you think that oh man, Marxists are such angry people, but Richard is literally the nicest person I've ever met in my entire life. So I don't know. So, and he's also super patient. So there you go. I mean, I guess that's what you have to be if you're a student or a teacher. You have to be very patient with people. So,
that just reminds me of that time that Herbert McCabe talked about how the Sermon on the Mount makes you a good comrade because people want to work with people who are nice and good to each other.
Yeah, totally.
That's cool.
Yeah, super cool.
I also saw that you got interviewed by your school newspaper about the Magnificast. That's pretty cool.
That was really funny. One of my fave students, Gina Sanders, came and asked me if she could do a podcast interview with me, and I was like, oh, of course, because Gina is she's really cool and really smart, and she asked some really good questions. So if you guys are out there, you can check out our Twitter page for that, a link to that, and hear me talk about the Magnificast. It's nothing you probably don't know, but it was fun.
Yeah, it is fun. You do let out the secret that we just don't care about our Facebook account at all. So
yeah,
sorry, that's public now. Sorry, everyone.
Cat is out of the bag. Facebook is dumb, and I don't care about it. Man, it's just hard to get things on Facebook.
It is. It's so tedious. I don't know, man. There's so many things to post.
If they could just all be one thing, it would be great, but they aren't.
It would be great. This week, what have I been doing? I have been still getting over being sick. I've still got it in my throat a little bit. That's not great. But one cool thing that happened at the Institute for Christian Studies, we hosted a woman named Kate Hennessy, who is the granddaughter of Dorothy Day. And she came to give a talk about a book that she wrote about Dorothy Day and about her mom and about the Catholic worker. And that was really cool and super fun. We recorded it. RCS is going to have a podcast, which is really neat. So hopefully it won't be too long till that's on the internet somewhere.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing that. That's so cool.
Yeah, she was awesome. You should all read her book, actually. I mean, The Catholic Worker is a very cool Christian leftist institution, basically. But she, I don't know, she has an interesting perspective on it by virtue of it being like a part of her family history and not just, a thing that she got into because she was like a young, like, lefty Catholic or something, the way that most people do. So, yeah, really cool, like, intimate portrait of that whole movement.
Yeah, that's really neat. Dang. We'll retweet that once it comes out because that sounds like something I want everyone to know about.
Yeah, it's good.
Before we get started, I want to make a quick note about some really important Magnificast news, and that is that we're getting buttons.
Oh yeah, we are getting buttons. That's right.
We're getting a big bag of good buttons, and if you want one, you can become a patron, and then we'll give you one. We'll send you one, and I think that's how you do Patreon. Really, is that you're supposed to give people things, but we haven't really done that yet. So we have a lot of good patrons that have been supporting us, and we appreciate that so much. So in the next few weeks, you guys will be getting your earthly reward here. Don't store it up or anything, but you'll be getting a good button in the mail from the Magnificast.
That's right.
So that's really cool.
One day it will be victim of moth and rust, like all things. But until then, right. It will be a very cool addition to your jean jacket or backpack.
Yeah, thanks for completing that joke for me. I didn't quite get through all the way with storing up your treasures on Earth, but I appreciate that.
It's just it's all part of this collective revolutionary consciousness. We're on the same page. Just got to help each other fill it out. It's all dialectical, right?
Yeah, that's how the jokes get done after communism. Is you have to wait for your friends to finish them for you.
That's right. Oh man, communist late night TV is going to be so good.
Oh gosh, yep, I hope so.
All right, so let's think of a segue here. Maybe we don't have one. Maybe that is the segue. Thinking of one and then not having one.
Oh, hey, here's a good segue. So at the beginning of this, Dean gave a good shout out to all those nice DSA folks who won an election the other day. Speaking of people who are socialists and who win elections, let's talk about Allende for a second. Yeah, I know that was a good segue. I feel very strongly about that one.
As you should. You should do the segues from now on. You've earned it.
Just that one. That was a good one. I don't know. So Allende was an important socialist figure in South America. He was like the first elected Marxist in Chile, and a really interesting figure. After that election in Chile, though, a really interesting thing happened within the Catholic Church, and I guess churches in general, Christians in general, tended to pay attention to this election in Chile. Unsurprising, Protestants and Catholics. So I guess the interesting thing is that after the election of Allende, a lot of Christians kind of jumped on that good socialist bandwagon and started a sort of movement that kind of spread across South America and eventually into North America. We'll talk about that in the future, but not this week. Called Christians for Socialism. Isn't that neat? So this episode, we're going to pick up on that thread about Christians for Socialism. This is initially something we read about in that Fidel and Religion book, but now we're going to kind of explore it a little bit deeper here. So we're going to talk about Christians for Socialism, what that was about, what it looked like in Chile, and then some thoughts about it from a really someone I didn't know about until very recently, but Gonzalo Arroyo, who is a Marxist economist and also a Jesuit. So we've got some history stuff here, and there's also some sort of liberation theology stuff going on here. So Dean, do you want to start and kind of tell us about the history of what's going on here?
Yeah, so in Chile, the kind of watershed moment, I guess, is when a group of 80 priests got together and they were trying to think about how to support the Allende government in a way that was authentic to their own ministry as priests, but also authentic to their own, sympathies as actual socialists. Most of them worked in places that were super poor in Chile, And, they had been thinking really hard about how to solve those problems materially and not just, minister to those people. And that was a motivating factor in trying to figure out how to support the Allende government. And it's a pretty interesting moment because a lot of these priests had watched what had happened in Cuba, where the Catholic Church was not present as a revolutionary force, and they didn't want that to happen in Chile. And they felt, like we talked about last week, that it wasn't totally unreasonable that the Catholic Church had been somewhat disciplined by the Cuban government, the revolutionary government. And they thought, well, there's no reason that has to happen. And if the church was actually supportive of socialist policies, then there would be no need to discipline it in that way. And surprised, they were right. They actually formed a very significant contingent of Allende supporters. And then also, eventually, when Allende was overthrown by Pinochet, the Christians for Socialism served as a really important resistance group, or able to organize resistances really well anyway. So there's a lot of history in between all that, obviously, but that's kind of the short of it. They flared up when Allende was coming on the scene, and then after Pinochet, they, at least in Chile, were ultimately disbanded because of a fascist regime. But really fascinating, high-octane couple of years there.
Yeah, I think what's so cool about this movement is that it basically proves what Fidel said right, in terms of like the antagonism between Christians and socialists, insofar as like, I mean, Fidel says like it didn't like have to be this way. The reason that they seized the schools or whatever was not because they were Christian, but because they were reactionary. And here we see like Christians who are not reactionary and not being a problem for the government. So there you go. To shed a little bit of light about like kind of like what the feel of this movement is, I'm going to read a little bit here from the declaration that was signed by the 80 priests. Is that cool?
Yeah, totally.
All right. So this is kind of from the middle. This is my favorite part, and maybe we can even read another part after this because it's all my favorite part, I guess. It's hard just to have one. Okay, so this is from the middle of the document, and here it says, "As Christians, we do not see any incompatibility between Christianity and socialism. Quite the contrary. As the Cardinal of Santiago said last November, there are more evangelical values in socialism than there are in capitalism." Not evangelical in the American sense, but in like the good sense. The fact is that socialism offers new hope that man can be more complete and hence more evangelical, more conformed to Jesus Christ, who came to liberate us from any sort of bondage. Thus, it is necessary to destroy the prejudice and mistrust that exists between Christians and Marxists. To Marxists, we say that authentic religion is not the opiate of the people. It is, on the contrary, a liberating stimulus to revivify and renew the world constantly. To Christians, we offer a reminder that our God committed himself personally to the history of human beings. And we say that at this present moment, loving one's neighbor basically means struggling to make this world resemble, as closely as possible, the future world that we hope for and that we are already in the process of constructing. I read that bit just to demonstrate that this is not any type of like liberal social justice type of Christianity, but it is in fact a real socialist Christianity, and it's, I think, important to draw that distinction out in a world in a place like the United States where like so much of Christianity gets kind of shoved into this like sort of social justice area rather than a real socialist movement.
Yeah, that's right. And the Christians for Socialism were intentionally trying to articulate themselves as revolutionary Christians as opposed to liberal reformist Christians. They had criticized the Christian Democrats in Chile and worldwide as the movement kind of spread, which, like you said, we'll talk more about later. That was also a driving theme. Christians for Socialism in other countries were also critical of local Christian reformist political groups and tried to encourage a more revolutionary stance, which is a really fascinating moment in history and really encouraging. Like this actually happened for real in real life.
It's so energizing that this is actually the case. I guess one more kind of theoretical note before we get into more of the discussion about the history. It's kind of worth noting that this exactly like this movement picks up on something that Che Guevara says. So it's like it's not even like the impetus is of course Christian, but the that bridge that is kind of being built is coming from both sides. So Che is pretty famous for saying I call him by his first name because like we're really good friends.
Yeah.
He says that the Latin American Revolution will be invincible once Christians join it. So like it's when Christians dare to make revolution and total commitment, that the Latin American Revolution will be invincible. And like Christians for Socialism is that type of movement where it's like kind of taking up that cue that like they need to be in this movement just alongside socialists. So this bridge is being built, I think, from both ends, that it's not just like Christians doing it, but Marxists are trying to reach out too in that way.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating about this document, the Declaration of the 80 Priests, is that there are so many moments throughout it where they are willing to make real positive statements about material processes that are really going on. So it's not just a kind of theoretical document where they're like, you know, maybe someday we'll be friends, Marxists and Christians. So maybe there are points of contact between us in terms of doctrine or ideas or impulses. They're really aware of the difficulties of implementing socialism. Like there's a passage where they say, we feel that much sacrifice will be entailed in the implementation of socialism, that it will involve a constructive and united effort if we are to overcome our underdevelopment and to create a new society. Obviously enough, this will provoke strong resistance from those who will be deprived of their special privileges, hence the mobilization of the people is absolutely necessary. And that's a pretty amazing thing. They also go on to say, we note that there are large groups of workers in favor of the changes taking place and who are benefiting from them, but who are not actively involving themselves in the processes that has already been initiated. The union of all workers, whatever their party loyalty may be, is crucial at this juncture. Our country is being offered a unique opportunity to replace the existing system of dependent capitalism and to promote the cause of the laboring classes throughout Latin America. I mean, that's like pretty wild that they're just aware of all those things and trying really hard to find a way to organize people politically as Christian priests.
Yeah, it is really, really interesting. It's just such a jarring thing to read Christians who aren't reactionary for like once in my life.
I know it seems too good to be true, but it's not. It is true.
Yeah,
and good.
It is true and very good. That's right. The concluding point of this this declaration, I think, is also really good. That I really like. It's a strong conclusion. It says, "It's a time full of risk, but also full of hope. We priests, like each and every Christian, must do what we can to make our own modest contribution. That is why we have come together and reflect. We've come together to reflect and prepare ourselves in this workshop on the participation of Christians in the implementation of socialism." So they're there for business, man. They're not just saying things.
Yeah, that's right. So that declaration is really cool. It's not that long. We'll put it somewhere that you can find it, probably in our tiny letter. But what is also really fascinating is just the historical kind of context that surrounds it. So it's not just priests who ended up participating in this. There's all kinds of lay people. And then even though the movement started as a kind of clerical movement, in some parts of Chile, it's mostly, radical priests trying to radicalize other people. And then in other parts of Chile, it's mostly like lay people who are trying to radicalize their clergy, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
We read a cool oral history of just this time period from 71 to 73. And they pull out a lot of these kinds of really, really cool dimensions. Did anything like stick out to you in that article, Matt?
I mean, like a ton of stuff, I guess. I think the thing that sticks out to me the most, though, is that it is not just like a movement of like sort of loosely affiliated people, but it is a movement with like a really strict discipline. That was kind of surprising to me.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's we're not experts on this whole movement yet. Maybe someday, but it's not like a specifically Marxist-Leninist kind of movement, right? It's like not that. It doesn't have like that brand with it. Doesn't have like that sort of like history and mode of organization that goes along with it. But it does have like a really rigorous set of discipline that maybe you kind of would expect from a Marxist-Leninist organization.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so let me just read this bit here that talks about like the monthly meetings of Christians for Socialism, because it is kind of intense. Okay, so one of the most interesting points to me, I think, is that they have this in the oral history, they lay out this sort of declaration of principles that Christians for Socialism had in Chile. There's a lot of good good principles in there, but it's also like pretty serious and pretty intense. It's not necessarily like I don't really know exactly the sort of like all the ideologies playing behind the scenes here, but it doesn't seem like Christians for Socialism was like a Marxist-Leninist movement or anything like that. But it does have like a level of intensity in terms of discipline and organization that is kind of characteristic of Marxist-Leninist organizations. So I don't know exactly what to make of that, but in the like the sort of Declaration of Principles, they say a lot about monthly meetings and kind of like some like interesting bits about sort of like the minutia of organization. So I'm going to read this little piece here that's about those monthly meetings and kind of how seriously they took them. And we can, I guess, talk about that. I don't know exactly what to make of it. It's just like an interesting thing. Okay, so let me read this here. So it says, for example, after making clear the priority of the monthly meeting, it adds that if anyone should be unable to attend, they should notify one of the members of the governing committee, which will act as a revolutionary tribunal. If the absence should be considered unjustified, the member in question could be expelled from the community. And then it goes on, point 9, which makes it clear that no one has the right to be a member of the community unless he is a Christian and an active revolutionary. So in order to participate in the community, members must reapply every month. This is also wild. But then it gets really good. Okay, so the first two parts are like, oh my gosh, this is super intense. But then the last part gets like kind of good, and I guess demonstrates the need for this type of discipline. The 11th and final point concludes that only revolutionary discipline can lead us to a revolutionary morality. Only a revolutionary morality can lead us to a revolutionary Christianity. Only a revolutionary Christianity can help us towards the liberation of man. So building intensities about these monthly meetings, but we see, I guess, when it comes to the 11th point, that this type of discipline is regimented and intense because they're trying to create, like very intentionally trying to create a very specific person, like a specific subjectivity, that you have to be a part of this community in a really involved way. What do you think, Dean?
That's right. I also was struck by that when I was reading it. I mean, I almost couldn't believe it. It's just the weirdest thing. But it's cool that they put it in there, because as I was kind of thinking through Christians for Socialism in general, I wondered how they might deal with problems of discipline, because they're specifically positioning themselves against, left center or left liberal tendencies within Christianity. And there is a, what you might call a desire on the part of left liberal people in general, I think, to appropriate revolutionary rhetoric and revolutionary aesthetics. And so it's really important, I think, for leftists to find ways to, not like weed people out because they're bad or something, but just to create a movement that is sustainable on the grounds that it actually wants to, to move along, rather than opening itself up in a way that is sort of naively bound to water down the idea. Yeah. So this was really fascinating to read, that one way in which they did that was having these meetings that were regular and making sure that people were committed to it, and also trying to make sure that the people that were within it understood what they were doing. And I mean, it's a little much. Like, reapplying for membership every single month is kind of a extremely funny pass-fail for authenticity, I guess. And you also have to imagine there couldn't have been that many of them to try to, weed through all those monthly applications. But nevertheless, it's a pretty cool idea. It's just a fascinating strategy.
I mean, on the one hand, I agree with you, right, that it is a little bit much. But on the other hand, it's actually not. I mean, I don't know. I'm just thinking it's kind of like a funny application of some really evangelical values, though.
That's true.
Reapply every month, or recommit yourself to Jesus at every altar call or something. It's kind of the same thing if you think about it.
The Cardinal Santiago was right. There's some real evangelical values in socialism.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to read that, actually. I mean, it is intense, but at the same time, it's not surprising to me that they kind of take this intense approach. I mean, the folks that are behind this, I mean, I don't know exactly the demographics of the movement, but these are 80 priests, right, that were behind at least the declaration. So we assume that there's a strong Catholic contingent here. And there's no one that knows more about the formation of subjects and discipline than the Catholic Church, right?
Yeah,
So I mean,
that's
like
right.
they know about spiritual formation. They know like what works, and what works, I guess, is probably making people show up. And this is one way to do it.
Yeah, that's true. Speaking of that, it being a kind of Catholic movement, at least in the beginning, I mean, there are Protestants who are involved in Christians for Socialism, especially around the world, but also in Chile. But it did start out, unsurprisingly, as a thickly Catholic movement by virtue of being in a thickly Catholic country.
Yeah.
And one interesting thing about this particular oral history is that it opens up just talking about how Vatican II was a really important moment for the church, and it created this principle of dialogue. And it's pretty cool because the way that it's articulated here is that the church decided dialogue is really important, but all of a sudden that meant Catholics were dialoguing with Marxists, and real dialogue changes people. But even more fascinating is that the author also talks about how in Chile there were already Catholic communities that were very close to Marxism. One thing that blew my mind was a mention of this thing called the Marxist-Leninist Dance of the Virgin del Carmen, which was apparently a thing in the 1930s in northern Chile. I don't know what is going on with that, but I would love to participate.
Are there any videos? Are there any like
I Googled it frantically this week, desperately trying to find something. I mean, the problem is I don't speak or read or write in Spanish, so
yeah,
I don't know. If you do, please send us anything you might be able to find. I did confirm in at least a couple other books that this is a real thing. It's not just like one guy doing some wishful thinking. But in any case, the reason he brings it up is he was saying that was in the 30s, and then Vatican II happened in the 60s. And what it meant is that these Marxist and Christian connections that had already existed in some places were now finally, it was like they had permission to be public.
Right.
And that permissiveness is what allowed something like Christians for Socialism to exist and not be immediately disciplined by the church hierarchy or something like that, because, they were taking very seriously the idea that the Catholic Church has decided that it's going to be buds and learn from other people outside of its own, community. And that's a pretty amazing thing.
Yeah, that is really amazing. And also there's dancing. So
that's right.
It's not my revolution if there's no dancing, I suppose.
Another cool thing about this oral history, and I alluded to this earlier, is that even though this was a clerical movement, Christians for Socialism in the beginning, it didn't end up being restricted to the clergy. In fact, as is so often the case with Catholic movements, the movement will only sustain itself by virtue of having people who are not priests participate in it, because priests can be disciplined and lay people have a little more leeway, I guess.
Right.
So there's a cool thing in this article where after the author is talking about all these different points that you were just referring to, the author says, to sum up, these witnesses experienced the Christians for Socialism as a vanguard of the revolution with a strong sectarian flavor, as an illumination of the introduction of pastoral agents into the popular sectors, which allowed them, together with the people, to work out a plan of liberation with a specific name, socialism, contrasting it critically with the project of the kingdom of God. As an autonomous experience within the Christians for Socialism, where the lay members were the protagonists and were not restricted by the confines of a clerical leadership excessively concerned with relations with the church. Yeah. I think that's just like also a very cool kind of moment, is that in that declaration we read earlier, the priests make a point to say, you got to get the support of the people. And they, lived that out. They actually tried really hard to do that.
Right. Yeah, that is really neat. Okay, so this is, I guess, drawing to a close of this historical section right here, and we have to kind of note it because I guess it's not all like dances and cool rhetoric about Christianity and socialism. So this is in Chile at least. This is kind of a short-lived movement from 1971 to 1973, with obviously some like preceding relationships that we just kind of talked about. So in 1973, 1973 is a relevant year because that's when the U.S.-backed dictator Pinochet kind of stepped in, and there was a coup against Allende, which really sucks and is not good at all. But what is worth noting that is that after the coup, This is from the Oral History article again. This is, I guess, just a direct quote. After the coup, the hierarchy of the church issued a public condemnation of Christians for Socialism, which even today many people do not understand because this constituted kicking a man when he's down. Which is kind of a funny way to put it.
Yeah.
This has been interpreted as an olive branch to the new regime and created a negative image of Christians for Socialism, which has lasted until today. The pejorative assessment of Pierre Bigot, I guess somebody commenting on this, reflects for us the official opinion of the Chilean church. There's nothing left for Christians for Socialism, but their declarations remain as a testimony of a kind of collective insanity that took hold of some clergy in Latin America at that time. So this is, I mean, kind of like a negative ending to this kind of interesting movement that happened for a time in Chile. And that comment at the end about how it's a testimony to a kind of collective insanity. At first I read that and I'm like, well, like what a dumb thing to actually say. Like that's kind of reactionary. But then I kind of thought about it a little bit more. And probably for the folks on the other side of that coup, that is exactly how they felt about it. Like that socialism does not make any sense, right? That this is the public condemnation of the Christians for Socialism is, of course, a logic that cannot make any sense of socialism whatsoever. They can't see the value of it. So of course they think it's a type of insanity, because for what is sane for regular people, socialism is insane for people who want to accrue nothing but profits and private property and exploit other people. So of course that makes sense.
Yeah. The biggest irony, of course, being that Chile would go on to be the experimental laboratory for the Chicago School of Libertarian Economics and brutally ravaged that country.
Yeah, so talk about insanity, really.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Chile is a very tragic kind of country in that sort of way, a huge victim of American interests, as in so many Latin American countries. But it is wild that in that same country there was a thing called Christians for Socialism. Just an amazing thing.
Yeah. In the coming weeks we'll talk a little bit more about like what happened to this movement post Chile, because it does spread outside of Chile. So it ended up being the events of Chile sowed the seeds for a bigger Christian movement that we'll talk about in the future. But I guess just want to like put that little like glimmer of hope in there that this is not all for naught or anything. It wasn't just like a failed thing. It actually went on to be more. But in the case of Chile, American imperialism squashed this movement.
So that history is from a guy named David Fernandez. We didn't really mention that at first. I don't know. Probably should have done that. But here's
shout
your
out to David Fernandez. Thanks for this article.
You did it. And it's very good. We'll put like a citation to that and everything also in the tiny letter so you can find it and read it. It's really fun. Pretty short, easy to read. But there's also some stuff we were reading from this guy, Gonzalo Arroyo. I mean, we were doing all this research trying to figure out more about the movement. And this guy just kept coming up. It turns out he's a Chilean Jesuit who was also a Marxist economist. He has a PhD in economics, and he was a member of the Christians for Socialism from, the beginning, and then continued to write and think about it later on. So we found a document from 1973, which is what he calls a Christian response to Christians for Socialism, which is a title that I love.
Yeah.
And then also we found an interview in 1974, so after the Pinochet government had been installed, with Blackfriars, New Blackfriars, which is a radical Catholic Dominican journal. So, Matt, do you want to just talk a little bit about the Christian response? I just thought that was such a great title for like a little reflection.
Yeah, I think so too. So I think the sort of functional purpose this has is that it just kind of gives us a little bit more of an idea about the sort of like character of the movement. Like I said earlier, it's not like a Marxist-Leninist movement. So kind of figuring out the ideology and like what's all happening there behind the scenes is, I think, important for me and for this podcast, just because it's like what we're all about. So we pulled out a few good quotes from this Arroyo Christian response essay that I think are kind of telling, that kind of gives us more of an idea about what this movement was like. So let me read this piece here and we can kind of talk about it. So Arroyo says, from its own definition, we thus derive that Christians for Socialism is not a political party in any of the countries in which it operates, nor does it take the place of political parties which struggle in the interest of people. Neither is it forthright acting to seize power that would compete or replace the vanguard political movements in each country. While Christians for Socialism does not operate directly on the structures of society, the realm in which it does operate is that of affecting people's consciences. Oh my gosh. Especially the Christian's conscience. To this end, it organizes grassroots communities in the form of secretariats. These are not movements, but places of encounter for all Christians of the left who seek unity among the people. These are places where people put together experience and information, where people try to unmask the past manipulations of the Christian faith, which are often caused by capitalism. These manipulations have alienated many Christians from the revolutionary process. Though its secretariats, Christians for Socialism is trying to redress the imbalance and to discuss revolution on less alien terms. Okay, so I really appreciate this description of like what's going on, because again, it's not like laying out sort of the ideology behind the party necessarily, or not. I'm sorry, not even the party. It's not laying out the ideology behind the movement, but it's kind of telling you like how it works and like what's going on
Right.
there and what the function of these places are, right? So it's they set up like actual places where people can talk about Christianity and socialism and like what it means to be a revolutionary, and like ways that Christianity has acted against like the good of the people in some pretty interesting ways. So I think that you can see the social function behind all of this, and you get to see a little bit of like what's actually happening, like maybe at these monthly meetings that you have to go to. So it's cool on a lot of fronts. I like the idea though that it's not a party, it's not replacing a party, it's not trying to seize power, it's not doing anything of the kind. All it is it's like sort of like an element of a cultural revolution, trying to create a cultural shift in Christians and the ways they think about politics, and that's something I can really appreciate.
Yeah, it's cool that it's, it serves a lot of functions at the same time. It's a kind of educational apparatus where it's trying to help Christians understand both their own faith, the way in which that their faith has been mobilized toward ends that are not very good, but also possibilities for their own faith. So the idea is not, well, you just have to abandon it because it's a reactionary bourgeois phenomenon, but you can actually find resources within the Christian tradition to support leftist causes, and you can help those leftist causes make sense to other Christians. I think that's a really interesting thing. It's this network of people who are basically just trying to talk to each other and find ways of strategically being useful, ways of building each other up and building up their societies. I think there's a cynical way of understanding Christians for Socialism where you look at it as a just a tool used by the Allende government or something, or just
like a propaganda machine or something for Christians.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think that's the case, though.
Yeah, that's the most fascinating thing. Is it's absolutely not the case. They were vilified that way. In the oral history, they talk about how there are a variety of ways people tried to kind of write them off. But as you can see in something like this, as Arroyo is explaining it, it's just, these are Christians who think that authentically to be a Christian means to get involved, get your hands dirty with the material processes that are happening right in front of you, even and maybe especially when they're not driven by Christians.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that definition about what Christians for Socialism is in that Arroyo piece? Because I think that's a good point here.
Yeah, so there's a moment where Arroyo is dealing with some of the ways that Christians for Socialism has been vilified ideologically. And he says, in response, we ought to listen to Christians for Socialism define its own position. First, the group defines itself as Christians deeply committed to the struggle for liberation of the oppressed in Latin America, and also to the liberation struggle of the Third World at large. For these Christians, and this has come out not out of faith, but out of political judgment, this struggle consists of the destruction of capitalism in order to build in its place a new socialist society. Second, as a group, these Christians do not conduct party-oriented political action, but they do have an obvious political importance because they conduct a struggle in ideology, and because they call the Christian conscience in Latin America and around the world. Third, Christians for Socialism defines itself by the act of living in small, new communities, almost invariably closer to the people, communities through which it seeks to conduct a new way of living and of expressing faith in Christ. All those things are very cool. The last thing is interesting to me because, as we've talked about before on the podcast, when we were becoming formative Christian thinking people, adults, in one way or another, new monasticism was a big thing. And things like the Catholic Worker was still, popular in like young people's memories. And those are all very good. Like, those are cool things. I don't mean to disparage them. But what's really fascinating about this is that it seems like something that's analogous to that, except with explicit revolutionary ends, which neither of those other two movements are necessarily as concerned with.
Yeah, so Shane Claiborne, get at us. Let's do this, man.
That's right.
Fix your ideology first, and then we'll talk, I guess. Actually, but yeah.
We'll fix each other's ideology.
I suppose that's all right.
We'll all get together and sort it out, but within the context of revolutionary struggle.
Yeah.
What strikes you about that, Matt? The way that Arroyo has sort of articulated them defining their own position.
Yeah, I think that's good. It's actually, I mean, we've been kind of getting into this more lately, behind the scenes of the Magnificast. But we see this kind of this idea pop up a lot in their literature about how important it is to actually just listen to like what they were saying and like what their actual positions are. I think that it seems almost like a requirement of every piece we've read about Christians for Socialism to define that they're not actually a party and that they're like some kind of like, parapolitical, parachurch organization. And I think that's good and that's worth noting. I guess what sticks out to me though is two things. So first and foremost, that like they're real practicing Christians like doing this work, who are like committed and like are actually like mobilizing together to do this, which is, I mean, again, in my imagination, completely wild. The thing that I do love about it too is that like there's like this movement that you see a lot, a sort of rhetorical movement and ideological movement that's worth pulling out here. That is like to be a person, to be a good Christian who's engaged in the world is also to be a good Christian who's like looking for the destruction of capitalism, and that is
that's right.
So good for me as a person. I like that a lot. That they make that rhetorical connection between those things. Something that just, I mean, Christians in the United States can't even imagine. They can't even imagine how their faith would be that political, or how they could translate like, I don't know, the Sermon on the Mount or the Gospel or any foundational ethical teachings from the Bible and make them like political in any systemic way. Like Christians in America, in the United States can't figure that out, but like we see people doing it right here in front of us, and it's important, and we should pay attention to this so much.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It is kind of crazy to imagine Christians who are capable of understanding the material conditions around them and then jumping into them. I don't know, that's just a wild thing.
It is. What's important, I guess, is that Christians for Socialism is articulated as neither being the church, sort of in the big sense, and it's also not a party. But Christians for Socialism, Arroyo goes on to say, is quite conscious of like that fact that they're neither the church as a whole and they're neither a party as a whole. It's sort of like in this like interstitial space between those things. So Arroyo goes on to say that Christians for Socialism is quite conscious of and realistic about its relationship with the church. It recognizes that in general, the masses in Latin America clearly perceive the voice of the church and therefore of Christ as incarnate as in the church symbols, which are centered in the bishops and the clergy. Hence, the group has never closed itself off from the hierarchy of the church, both for reasons of faith and in order to ensure greater effectiveness in its actions toward the liberation of men. So this is also interesting to me too, because it's not like they're not trying to, while they're not a part of the church and they're not a part of the party, this organization isn't a part of either of those things, that they're kind of in between. It doesn't seem like they're like actually closed off to either of those things either. Like they're not trying to be separatists. Right. They're not trying to like, they're not trying for like another Reformation or another schism, which I think is important. Is an important caveat for the Catholics in the crowd there. That they're not trying to get away from the church, but they're trying to be open on one end to the hierarchy of the church, because those symbols are important and that hierarchy is important for them. It's good that they're not thinking through this in any kind of shallow way or any utopian way. They're really open to, I think, all of the organizations that they're kind of connected to.
Yeah, that's right. And I appreciate that there's a realism about the fact that they want to be connected to the church itself, not just because of their faith, which is kind of a given, I guess. Like if you give them any benefit of the doubt, you assume that they're trying to be faithful Christian people, and I think that should be a given anyway. So I like that they reiterate that, but even, I guess, more interestingly, they want to be connected to the church because they understand that it has a real symbolic power for the people, like for the masses, and kind of treating the church as like a people's movement in that way and trying to connect with things that connect with the people is such a fascinating thing. I feel like that would be something that the left might be able to learn from Christians for Socialism, is that there is a symbolic weight in Christian authorities, and whether or not you believe them or believe in them is kind of irrelevant. They do hold real, tangible organizing power.
Yeah, that's right. When we see this movement move to the United States in some ways, that becomes like one of the central themes of the writing from the folks that were involved. I don't want to tip the hand too much, but when Christians for Socialism got organized in the United States, one of like the big topics of conversation that they had was about the reappropriation of Christian symbolism and like making that work for revolutionary ends. And I think that's rather than capitalist ends, So it's a theme. It's a theme that persists throughout some of this writing.
That's right. So there's a conclusion to this response essay, which really draws on these symbols in a way that sort of performs maybe what we were just talking about. Do you want to read that real quick, and then we can go on to the interview where he had with the Blackfriars?
Yeah, sure. It's a good conclusion. I mentioned at the very beginning of this in the beginning of the episode, but I'll do it again here because it's that good.
Yeah.
When Christians dare to make a revolutionary commitment that is total, says Che Guevara, then the Latin American Revolution will be invincible. Christians for Socialism is just one gathering of Christians who are attempting to make an integral revolutionary commitment. We are en marcha with the poor and exploited, those whose victory will be the victory of the whole people. Sin and human weakness reaches into all of us like the most bitter cold and slows down the march toward final victory. But now, as always, God is acting to bring us closer to the goal. The day we hope for will surely come, a day when Christ and all humanity will triumph. So it's that connection between Christian eschatology and socialism that I think is like already latent in socialism, but it's being brought out here and really mobilizing that idea. It's so funny even to use this language because I can't even count the amount of times I've been sitting in church on like a Sunday morning and like the pastor has said something even similar though, like God is acting to bring us closer to our goal, right? The day will come when Christ and humanity will triumph, and it's like hell yeah, but that's actually communism here, so that's like funny. It's weird. It's a phrase that I've heard a million times. That usually refers to like the rapture or something silly like that. But mobilized towards something that is actually good. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, that's right. No, I like that a lot. And that eschatological vision is such a motivating force, right? In Christianity, it carries a symbolic weight, but Marxism also has its own eschatological component, and it's cool to kind of see those two things being put together here.
Yeah, I think so. Well, so the next kind of bit we looked at here to investigate more about Christians for Socialism is again from Gonzalo Arroyo. It's an interview in New Blackfriars, and it's interesting for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of similar things going on, I think, in this article. In this interview. I think like maybe the most, I don't know, one of the most edifying moments in this interview that I want to pull out here at the very beginning of this part of the podcast is that when the interview opens up, it's not immediately about Christians for Socialism. Instead, the interviewer asks Arroyo, like, what are actually the most pressing concerns, like globally? I mean, specifically for Latin America, like what are the most pressing concerns? And the way Arroyo responds is good and really interesting because what he lays out are, I think, some pretty common leftist concerns, but because he is an economist, he has a really, I think, nuanced way of talking about them. That's cool. But like the framing for each, like the content of each is definitely a leftist concern, but the framing is always informed by Christianity when he talks about it, and I think that's really worth noting. That's right. So like when he's laying out these concerns, he's like going through them, and like ecology is a concern and inflation is a concern. and like, but so is like food and hunger. So like that kind of stuck out to me, that he pulls out food and hunger as an important concern, because like that is like a fundamentally Christian concern.
Yeah, that's right.
Like feeding the hungry, and like giving relief to the poor is like is something that you could walk into any evangelical church and just be like, hey, this is what I'm for, and people would be like, oh yeah, sounds good.
Yeah.
Right. But
Right.
he frames the problem as a problem that is both Christian. It's a Christian concern, but it's connected to the problem of global capitalism, and like that connection is, I guess, what's always missing from Christianity to me whenever I go to church, is that we can, we obviously want to feed people who are hungry, because like of course you do that. But we can never make that connection to global capitalism, and that Arroyo does this, and that the movement does this in general, is absolutely astounding and amazing to me.
Yeah, there's a great comment later on in the interview where Arroyo talks about basically why the church is not capable of making that connection.
Yeah.
This is on page 495, but he says, the churches in general are not aware of the crucial problems and challenges confronting humanity today and tomorrow. They are quite simply incapable of understanding why there are millions of persons who, in the international socio-economic framework discussed above, experience suffering, repression, and death. Whereas the Christian communities, as founded by Jesus Christ, ought to be the conscience of humanity and the salt of the earth, they appear at the moment as being in bondage to history. They receive blows, but they give none. That's a wild thing to say.
Yeah.
Even when the most fundamental rights of man are flouted, as for example in torture and repression in the European fascist countries, they remain incapable of reacting. Of course, there are dotted here and there some bishops able to intervene with prophetic courage, but the hierarchies, and one must indeed speak chiefly of these when one refers to the church as an institution, remain in general incapable of exercising an enlightened leadership. In face of the world problems of our time, inflation, population, food shortage, and so on, thrown up by the very structures of international capitalism, they have difficulty in breaking out of an abstract discourse in which words like democracy, liberty, justice, peace play the role of an opiate. At the very moment when humanity is in a world crisis, where its own survival is at stake, they seem to have abdicated their responsibility to be a moral force, to orient humans, or at least Christians. In other words, the churches are no longer salt. And, I mean, that's such a, like, it's incisive as a critique. I mean, it burns a little bit, but it's also, yeah. I think, really, it gets everything out on the table in the way that it ought to be said.
Right.
He also goes on to say that there are reasons that the church is like institutionally allied with capitalism, like materially, but yeah. I think that in terms of just a moral conscience, that really helps.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is the same kind of sentiment we see in like Herbert McCabe and stuff too, that Christians just like we like know how to respond to people, but we can't like think about the larger way that people like that we should, right? Like we can think about like the ethical implications about like loving your neighbor and like and why you should do that, but we can't fundamentally think through who our neighbor even is in a systemic way that can make any good analysis and affect any like systemic change. And I don't know, every time someone can make that point, I think it's worth it. It's worth doing.
That's right. Yeah, and I think I just really appreciate Arroyo laying it out as simply as he does. You know, that the church is supposed to be salt, and it just isn't.
Yeah.
I mean, that line that I kind of pulled out as I was reading it, you know, the church receives blows, but give none. That's such a... I mean, it is a very punchy phrase in itself.
Yeah. Well, to wrap this conversation up, let me refer back to something we said last week at the end of the podcast. We had that quote towards the end from Dorothy Soleil about, maybe you feel like you are a Christian without a church or a socialist without a party. And I think that resonated with a lot of people that heard it. We saw some GIF reactions that indicated that is the case, at least. But there is, I think, a little bit, like maybe like a word of advice here from Arroyo to all of us Christians in America who feel that way, who feel without a church and without a party, for sure. So Arroyo says, we pursue a task in the church. We aim at a church in solidarity with the interests and struggles of the workers, but without breaking with the present church. If we want to gather together and form a group as Christians inserted in the heart of the organized proletariat, it is firstly to cultivate our faith, to make our hope dynamic, to develop our theology. Our task is first of all a task as a church, as Christians. Admittedly, at present, many of the hierarchy tend to treat us as marginals, saying to us, "You cannot continue in that line, for it's not the church's line." And the hierarchies are justified to the extent that the church to which they refer, we've analyzed above, the church that as it is reactionary. As for us, we wish to maintain a commitment to church solidarity. Even if we admit that our position is difficult in the short term, we think that in the medium and long terms it will appear more clearly in the eyes of a growing number of the faithful as a service to the church and a service to the authentic message of Jesus Christ, which summons Christians to identify themselves with the oppressed, struggling for their liberation and simultaneously for the liberation of all mankind. I guess the moral of the story here in relationship to the disconnection that leftists might find and face in their individual and particular churches is that it is hard in the short term to get people to kind of be on board with whatever it is you want to do. But this is actually the mission of the church in the first place, the liberation of humans from sin, and especially as it presents itself as capitalism. So even though it might be hard to get people on your side, I think that this is the work that we ought to be involved in.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, too, Arroyo goes on to say, in addition to the task in the church, that Christians for Socialism also pursues a political task. And this might help, too. He says, this task is not that of an avant-garde and is situated in a restricted sector of the global political field, namely that of culture and ideology. Our business is not to constitute a new political organ. We are already inserted within autonomous organizations, which the workers have made for themselves, and it is there that we must continue to struggle in solidarity with companions who do not share our faith. And then at the very end, he says, more positively, it's a matter of showing by our practice as much as by our words that the Christian faith can and must become more and more at home in a socialist option, even if it cannot become enclosed within that option. And I think, being a Christian socialist without a church, without a party, one solution to that is just to go to both of them.
Yeah.
Find a church, find a party, or an organization, an association, whatever it is, a strike, something that you can go to. I mean, in my own experience, we've talked about this in the past, I guess, with a number of guests, but it really does help kind of solve that alienated feeling to get out and meet other people and actually do something and feel like you've contributed to, a material struggle, either in the short term in terms of one local strike or one local advocacy campaign, or in the long term of building a party and thinking with party members and paying party dues and all that kind of a thing. There are already organs out there for you to be part of. The church is a thing. It's a hard thing to be part of, but it's a thing that needs socialists. And also socialist parties are things that are out there that you can join quite easily, and they might actually need Christians. So I think that's a really tangible step you can take. And the coolest thing is that you wouldn't be the first person to do it. You would be one in a long, long line of people in a very big cloud of witnesses who have already done it.
That's right.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon. We'll send you one of those good buttons when we get them in the mail. You can find us at patreon.com/themagnificast. You can also subscribe to our tiny letter. We referred to that a couple times in this episode. That's tinyletter.com/themagnificast. You can also find us on Twitter at the Magnificast. Surprise. You can also find us on Facebook. Same name. And we don't post that very often, as we revealed, but maybe we'll change that. Maybe this is the embarrassing moment we needed to get our stuff together. Thanks for listening. Like Matt said a few times, we're gonna find more about this movement and a global movement. We'll continue to be inviting guests and all that kind of thing, but we're on the train. We're on the Christians for Socialism train, and we are not getting off till we've made all the stops.
Choo-choo.
We'll take you along. That's right, choo-choo. Choo-choo to socialism and Christianity. All right, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.